Hello everyone, this is my video presentation of terror management and how it may influence our actions. The title is If Death Comes for Me, I'll Come for You, and I hope you enjoy. So in regards to this topic, we're going to be asking, of course, is terror management or the fear of death another root of evil actions? And we'll be covering how exactly terror management works and in what sense we're going to consider it a root of evil actions. And the reading we're going to be using here is McGregor et al.'s Terror Management and Aggression, Evidence that Mortality Salience Motivates Aggression Against Worldview Threatening Others. So I wanted to open up with this quote. The things that frighten us the most are those that remind us of our fragile existence. And this quote, while it may seem rather lofty and intellectual, once we understand the subject behind it, makes a lot more sense. So let's explain partially. So let's try and understand what mortality salience is in the first place and how it regards terror management. So mortality salience exists as a subset of terror management theory, which is a feature specific to humans where we know that our deaths are inevitable, but because of our evolutionary biology, we still seek ways to avoid death, despite knowing that we will die. And it assumes two things. One is that cultural values give people meaning and permanence beyond death, whether this is religion, some self of identity and community, or even just one's own personal values. And the second thing is that self-esteem is based on living up to the said cultural values. And in that sense, self-esteem is, we think of self-esteem in terms of how one feels about themselves in regards to their values. So mortality salience, which we'll be abbreviating it as MS, or being made aware of your death, causes cultural worldviews to become fragile. So the problem is, since cultural values are meant to give us permanence beyond death, if our cultural worldviews are not able to stand up to our awareness of our death, then it becomes very difficult for us to move on in the world. And what we notice in a lot of previous studies, which won't be covered here, people who experience MS tend to evaluate people who validate their worldview better and those who challenge it worse. So to boil that down, essentially, if someone supports their worldview, they will appreciate them more, and those who challenge their worldview will not be appreciated as much. And what's important to the study that we'll be looking at is MS is strongest from an experiential standpoint. That is, when a person is meant to think about the process of their death, rather than from an analytical standpoint, from the rational mindset of just being aware that you will die. So now let's look at this quote once again. So now we understand that the whole point is the things that frighten us most are those that remind us of our fragile existence, because the things that frighten us most remind us or challenge our cultural worldviews and therefore challenge our self-esteem. Now, while this quote on its own has some merit if we're going to use terror management theory, that's not the question we're asking here. We're asking if terror management can lead to evil. And so let's consider this quote by Margaret Miller. Violence is their instinctive response to fear. So we take something that frightens us the most, and we suggest that fear is instinctively an antecedent to violence. So what do we expect to happen here? That's what we're going to be asking here, and I hope as you go through this process with me, you'll be able to understand where this thought process comes from. Okay, so let's start with just some background info. So in this study, initially we started with a sample of 74 introductory psychology students at the University of Arizona. 38 are male, 36 are female, so we don't have to worry about having problems with not enough people of each gender being represented here to confound our results. So unfortunately, 4 of the people were excluded, 3 who were suspicious of the conditions of the study in the first place, as in during the process of the study, they were skeptical on what the purpose of it was. And 1 who had mentioned that they were aware of how hot sauce could be used to harm someone, which is where the concept for the hot sauce paradigm comes from, which we'll be discussing later. So ultimately, our final sample was 70 intro psych students. And then each of them completed a bipolar scale. And The scale is from 1 to 9, 1 being extremely conservative to 9 being extremely liberal. And specifically, the experimenters chose the ranges of 2 to 4, which represented moderately conservative, and 6 to 8, which represented moderately liberal for the experiment. Now, it may not make sense if you're trying to analyze in terms of terror management. Well, why wouldn't you want people who are as opposed in viewpoints as possible? I think that it's possible that it's because we don't want the participants to be behaving negatively towards worldview threatening others out of bias rather than because of mortality salience, because the last thing we need are more confounding variables messing with our results. Of course, this approach of targeting the moderately conservative and moderately liberal is also more likely to target general populations, because the more you go on a fringe, since politics follow a regular distribution, you're going to expect less people on each side of the branch. So let's talk about what the participant experience as they go through the study. So first, the experimenter explains the study on the base of personality and impressions of others. And then the participant is expected to write a 5-minute short paragraph regarding politics and give it to the experiment to exchange with others. After the completion, the participants work on a personality packet, and it has 3 pages. The first page is simply a filler personality page. The second page is some sort of averse topic, and there were 2 topics that participants could receive. Either they would have questions regarding things such as thinking about the emotions surrounding your death, and listing responses on that, or thinking about emotions surrounding your next exam. Again, both of these are aversive topics. But as we know from the experimental side, we want to be able to study how mortality salience is going to affect aggression in terms of acting on evil actions. And so it's important that we have this differentiation here. And notice also that experiential mortality salience is the goal. It's not that the person is going to comment on their thoughts about their death. It's simply putting them into that state of thinking, well, how will I feel about death? That's the concept here. And the third page is the PANAS X inventory, which is a way of testing for positive and negative affect. And so the purpose here is just to make sure we don't have any other confounding variables, to make sure that affect isn't something that affects our results. So this is what the participant sees when they receive an essay of either their opposing or not opposing viewpoint. You'll notice that on both sides we have rather inflammatory commentary on each side, and you'll notice that each line, each of the paragraphs are very similarly structured. We have the liberals are the cause of so many problems in this country, and we have conservatives are the cause of so many problems in this country. It is worth noting that these were random. It's assigned to each group. It's not that someone who declared moderately liberal would guaranteed get the liberal targeted paragraph. They could also get the conservative targeted paragraph. But the point is they received one of these 2 paragraphs. And then in what we will call a follow-up study, participants were told that they would be analyzing food preferences relative to personality. So in that specific day, the way the experimenters were framing it, they were going to be testing dry foods and spicy foods. So first, the participant would fill out a taste preference inventory on a 21-point scale. This would either be, the 6 options they would have to cover were sweet, sour, creamy, salty, spicy, and dry. And of course, since this is a 21-point scale, 1 would be no liking at all, 21 would be extreme liking. So we have a wide range of possible answers here. And then the experimenters randomly assign participants to either the hot sauce group or the dry food group. But none of the participants end up in any group but the dry food group, coincidentally. And as the ones eating the dry food, they will be allocating the hot sauce. So they would consume a cracker and then rate their experience of consuming said cracker on a 9-point scale. So this is where things become interesting. So the experimenter comes back with hot sauce, a styrofoam cup with a lid, a plastic spoon, wooden spoon, and water. The participant would be assigning hot sauce to another person, just as they were assigned a cracker in the previous phase of the experiment. But to avoid confusion, specifically, they would be assigning hot sauce to the persons whose paragraph they read. And the participant was made aware that said person disliked spicy food. So they were given the same taste preference inventory that the participant had filled out earlier, and it had denoted that the person to whom they were going to assign the hot sauce only rated spicy food as a 3, which was a rather low dislike, or a rather high dislike, rather low liking. And they would be able to taste the hot sauce with a wooden spoon if they decided so, and then they would use a plastic spoon in order to add spoonfuls to the styrofoam cup. After they had, and they were also let know that whatever amount they would be assigning to the other participant, they would have to consume that level of hot sauce fully, just as they themselves had to fully consume the cracker and then rate their experience of eating the cracker. After they had done so, they would have to answer 3 questions using the 21-point scales. How useful was the inventory on giving out the sample? How useful was the inventory on giving out the sample to that specific person? And to what extent did they like the food? The person that was being assigned the food. To what extent was it likely that they would like the food? At the end, they would discuss, they would be debriefed with the experimenters, but beforehand, they would fill out their own self-report of how much they had allocated to the person, and then the debriefing process would happen, and they would be told about the actual experiment. So what actually happened in the experiment? The experimenters only gave out 2 paragraphs in the first place, the ones we had seen, the ones derogatory towards liberals and the one derogatory towards conservatives. There were no other participants sharing paragraphs, and so the paragraphs used by the participants were just collected. And as we also know, participants were always ending up in the dry food group. So the hot sauce was serving as a tool to measure aggression against the other person whose essay they had read. And it was through a complicated process that they determined what consistency would be feasible of measuring. And so the experimenters had a manufacturer produce a hot sauce that was 5 parts Heinz chili sauce and 3 parts Tapatio salsa picante hot sauce. A very interesting process through which they had to determine that. But the point is, here's what we're looking at. So this table on the right refers to the average grams of hot sauce assigned, because they were able to weigh the weight of the hot sauce through the styrofoam cup. And what you'll notice here is, if you look at the column with the at the row with the rectangle, what that is denoting is how mortality salient within the matrix, those who were given the mortality salient prompt and those who were given the worldview threatening paragraph had a very high weight of assignment. And if we compare it to the exam control, we're noticing a difference of 11 grams here. And so what is notable is that mean is considered statistically significant, which is to say it is so significant that it is unlikely that the result could have been produced by chance. And so we also notice in the self-reports, the participants' self-reports of how much they had allocated, specifically in the mortality salience condition, had significance relative to the other 3 self-reports. So what these arrows are meant to indicate is that if we compare the self-report of those who were in the mortality salient condition and read the essay from the worldview threatening other, they did accurately report their estimate in spoonfuls relative to the result. And so that means that we have a correlation here between the self-reports, or I suppose a consistency between the self-reports and the weight being given out. So what can we make of this? In principle, with the stimulation of mortality salience, people are more likely to act aggressively towards those that threaten their worldview. And in this case, we simply saw that represented in the form of, if you are giving hot sauce to another person that would be willing to inflict, that would be liable to inflict pain on them. It was found that if we go back, it was found that you were more likely to see the mortality salient worldview threatening group assign more hot sauce than the other groups. And in fact, what the study does note, but we don't see a significant result for, is that the worldview consistent groups that were also in the mortality salient group did have lower mean weight and lower self-report estimates relative to the other groups. Sadly, that isn't a statistically significant result in this study, but it is something to consider in other studies. So the point essentially is, in the right context, terror management can be considered another root of evil. It does require, at least in the conditions that we've outlined here, that an individual or a group threatens another group or individual's worldview after or before or after the experiential MS. And the point of this logic is the only way the individual or group that is being threatened can express that aggression is if they first have this instance of experiential mortality salience. At least in the study that we looked at, we didn't find that they did it the other way around. It wasn't that the group was given an opportunity to act on their aggression and then given mortality salient behavior. And I suppose that was mentioned in the control. If we look at the exam control, that is essentially the idea that is being telegraphed there. So we have to think about this carefully, because in our criteria of evil, we consider that evil is the act of doing harm intentionally and excessive relative to provocation. So objectively, we can say that harm is being done. If we use the hot sauce paradigm as an indicator, we can say that we are more likely as human beings to harm someone else if they are threatening our worldview. And is considering that the self-reports were accurate, we can also feasibly say that the intentionality is also there, because people are aware of how much hot sauce in the experiment they're giving out to other people. Now, in terms of excessiveness, it becomes difficult because we have to consider whether the worldview threatening will necessarily lead to high levels of aggression, because, of course, the hot sauce paradigm noted that we would be statistically significantly likely to harm someone. But the question is, how far will that harm go? And that is what we simply cannot answer with this current study. But I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a little bit about terror management, about mortality salience, and how the two can affect our acts of aggression and how they can solicit us to perform evil actions. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you have a good night. Take care.